Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's great to see such a large crowd here to talk about the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. My name is Melissa Mallon, and I am here on behalf of the ACRL Student Learning and Information Literacy Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee. We usually just say SLILC. That's a lot easier to say. And we are co-sponsoring, this is the second of a two-part series on the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning that we're co-sponsoring with the ACRL Instruction Section. So I just want to give a little shout out to them for all of their help with this. If you missed our first session, which was back in April, so it seems like it's been about a year since then, I am putting a link in the chat here to our LibGuide that has a link to the session recording for our part 1, which was just an introduction to SoTL. And that same spot is where we will be posting the recording from today's session. So if you'd like to catch up with that a little bit later on. I'm going to let the the presenters talk a little bit more about their experience with SoTL, but I just want to say thank you so much to Kara Bradley, Nancy Chick, and Margie McMillan for joining us today. They're three of the most interesting people to listen to, and they have such enthusiasm for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning that it's been just a pleasure for me to learn from them and talk with them. So I believe Margie's going to start us out. We'll be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, please post them there. We're also going to be on Twitter with the hashtag LibrarianSoTL. So I hope you'll join the conversation there too. And I will go ahead and pass it over to Margie in just a second. It takes a second to throw these little balls back and forth here.
Okay, I see the ball is in my court now. Before we start, I just want to say that we're drawing on the panel that Kara and I and Rhonda Huisman and Lauren and Melissa presented at ACRL, so a lot of that work we've incorporated into our slides. And I think each of us will just give a short introduction for people who might not know of our involvement with SoTL before we start each piece. So I'm Margie McMillan. I have been SoTL curious, I think, for my entire academic life, wondering about how students learn and how we know when they're learning and what teaching works and so on. I've been formally doing SoTL research since about 2003, and for the past 5 years at Mount Royal University, I've been involved with supporting the work of our Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, so working with other scholars. And one of the things that makes me very, very happy is to see the increasing integration of SoTL and information literacy work. So I'm in my happy place right now, and I hope you are too. Many thanks again to Rhonda Huisman and Lauren Hayes, as well as Melissa Mallon, who's convening this session. I'm going to talk, I'm going to get the hang of moving the slides along, and then I'm going to talk about using SoTL. And the first step really to getting involved in SoTL isn't necessarily diving in and conducting it yourself, but starting to get familiar with the literature and the work of others. And to read widely and well. I've been quoted before as saying, read outside your species. I think it's something that we can all bear in mind. SoTL occurs across the disciplines, across institutional contexts, across levels of education, and across the world. And if we only read SoTL that has to do with our narrow ideas of what we teach and what students learn, we're missing a big wide world of resources. That said, it can be a little more difficult to find SoTL work for a number of reasons. There is no set vocabulary. There's no one database like Scopus that has all of SoTL in it. So you need to search broad tools, things like your library's discovery tool or things like Google Scholar that search across disciplines in order to get the maximum benefit of the SoTL work that's out there. Some of it also is not in the academic world. It's in some of the more not necessarily popular, but some of the things you can access through Google, such as institution sites, conferences, working materials from various centers of teaching and learning. So don't be afraid to search outside of the classic academic literature paradigm, as well as outside of the classic library literature paradigm. And we've got many of these resources available at that bit.ly link that is showing on the screen. We've developed a sort of a starter kit for resources on SoTL that will benefit your work, whether you're reading it for ideas for your own teaching, whether you're using it to gain ideas for your research project, ways of looking at the literature, or ways of writing up SoTL, because it may feel a little bit different than writing up in your discipline. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Kara.
While we're passing that over, Margie, a question came
Sure.
up about SoTL literature and disciplinary journals. Do you tend to find a difference between where that literature occurs, whether it's in education journals, teaching, or do people tend to publish within their disciplines?
The answer is yes, all of the above. There is an increasing range of SoTL-specific journals like Teaching and Learning Inquiry that was shown in the previous slide. There are an increasing number of teaching journals within the disciplines, but it also shows up in some disciplinary core research journals and in the wider higher education and the educational research literature. That's part of the issue with finding it, is that it is so widely dispersed. The other issue is that it's not always called SoTL. So you need to be pretty loose with your subject searching terms as well. I hope that answers the question. It's not really much of an answer, it's just look everywhere. Really.
That's great, thank you.
So, hi everyone, I'm Tara Bradley and I'm a librarian at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, Canada. And for those American librarians online, I explain it by saying I'm above North Dakota and Montana. That kind of puts it into perspective. And I was seconded for a couple of years as the Associate Director of my campus's Center for Teaching and Learning. And that's when I became interested in SoTL. I think really the light bulb went off when I took that position and saw, hey, there's money for this. There's some grants and a lot of work that librarians at my institution are doing meet the criteria for this funding. So that for me was when the light bulb went off and I started to think about SoTL as something that was relevant to our work as librarians. I'm going to talk a little bit about doing SoTL and just kind of hit a few of the main points. We talked about this in our presentation at ACRL conference as well as a bit during our last webinar. But I just want to hit a few of the key points that you need to consider when you're doing SoTL. So of course, the first thing on your checklist is you need a question. And I'm sure we all have lots of questions. That thing about your teaching that you're thinking, does that work, or what's a better way to do this, or how are students understanding this concept? These kinds of questions that we all have. You need to identify one of those questions and make the decision that you're going to investigate it. And I think in a few minutes, Nancy's going to talk a little bit more about the types of questions that you can answer with SoTL research. The next thing is ethics approval. One of the first questions that does and really should come up when you're thinking about conducting SoTL research is research ethics. So an early step in any SoTL research process should be finding out about the ethical requirements that you need to meet before you conduct your research. And in many cases for SoTL research, you'll need to apply to your institutional ethics board for approval before you start any data collection. In Canada, we call this entity the REB, the Research Ethics Board, but I believe in the States it's more frequently called the Institutional Review Board, IRB. Requirements vary somewhat by institution and jurisdiction, but some issues really, regardless of where you're located, have an impact on whether or not you need ethical clearance, as well as the difficulty or ease with which you will obtain it. Some of these things are power differentials. So your role in the class will come into influence the ethical considerations around your research. If you have a position of power over the students in that class. For example, you're grading an assignment. You're going to have to negotiate that carefully and explain to the research ethics board how you're going to navigate that. You also need to talk about risk to participants. So a lot of things we're doing aren't high risk. We're not typically administering drugs in the classroom like you would find in medical research, but there still can be issues where if you are using an intervention that is believed to have a great impact on learning with one group of students and not using it on another group of students as a control, there can be some ethical issues around that, you know, whether you're disadvantaging certain students. Benefits to future students, your current students, as well as future students also comes into it if you can demonstrate that there is significant benefit associated with the research. Confidentiality and anonymity are also factors. So are your students going to be responding to a survey in a way that is completely anonymous, in which case there's really no risk to them? Or are you going to be able to identify individual student responses, but you can guarantee that that information will be kept confidential? Then that's a consideration as well. And then a big one at my institution is the intention to publish or disseminate. So if I'm doing a SoTL type project internally for internal process or procedure teaching improvement, I don't need ethics approval. But doing SoTL itself is really about doing this work and then disseminating it and sharing it. And if you're going to do that dissemination and sharing piece, you will often find that ethical clearance is required. And I see a question here. I also feel like power or grading has implications for students' responses. Will students be less honest in responses if they think it impacts their grades? Exactly. I mean, these are all issues. That's an issue that you have to negotiate and figure out the way that you can do this. You know, I was just actually before this session reviewing an RED application for a SoTL type project, and the researcher has involved another person, a third party, who's going to collect responses from students and anonymize them so that when the researcher is analyzing them, and she's doing this in hopes of getting more honest responses from students. So it's certainly something to be aware of. Unfortunately, a lot of people are intimidated at the thought of going through the RED process, and their research stops there. They're afraid to take that on. Don't do that. I'm on the RED, as I said, and I review applications. And our goal, and I think a goal shared by many review boards, is to facilitate research. So we want to enable research to proceed in a way that protects both the participants, but also you as the researcher. And I've really found that in my own applications, I've found that the process helps me to think through my project from beginning to end. And the feedback that I've received has also helped me to avoid pitfalls, things that I hadn't thought about, and allows me to be successful in my research. I really, as a reviewer, see myself as a critical friend who's on the researcher's journey. And they may never know who I am, but there's nothing like the delight in seeing their research come to fruition and be published. It's a great thing, so I really view myself as part of that, an invisible part, perhaps, of that team. So keep that in mind if you're feeling a little daunted by the research ethics approval process. Other things to think about, look for partnerships and support, and there's lots of potential partners on your campus. I mean, there's your other colleagues, your librarian colleagues, there are faculty and instructors who on your campus who are teaching in the disciplines and are interested in research on teaching, who may be willing to partner with you. We've also had some luck here with the Teaching Center, so Center for Teaching and Learning, as well as the Faculty of Education. They have a lot of interest and expertise in research on education-related topics. We've also found willing partners in groups like the Student Center, the Student Success Center, as well as the Students Union. So groups that are really invested in students getting the best possible educational experience are often quite willing to be partners on research that is geared towards that end. Also think about programs that are designed to support groups of students with unique needs. So our ESL, English as a Second Language program, has been quite responsive, as well as the Disability Accessibility Office. And think about librarians at other institutions. That's a way to increase the power and generalizability of the research that you're doing if it's done at more than one institution. And then also think about funding. Funding, depending on the nature of your project, isn't necessarily a make or break item. A lot of SoTL research goes on without any funding. So I don't think you need to regard a lack of funding necessarily as an end in itself. But watch for opportunities. And again, that campus teaching center often has funding available for research on teaching. Sometimes it's a designated SoTL fund. And watch for those opportunities, because there is an openness, I think, certainly at my institution and a few others I've been involved with, there's an openness to fund librarian research. So those are a few things to keep in mind when you are thinking about doing SoTL. And I am going to switch the slide and then pass control over to Nancy.
Excellent. Hi, this is Nancy Chick, not with a Canadian accent. I am at the University of Calgary, which is in the same city as Margate, but right above Montana. I am the academic director of the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning and the University Chair in Teaching and Learning. But I've been involved with SoTL since the mid-90s. When I was a graduate student, I think I told this story at part 1, but I'll just briefly tell it again. I was getting my PhD in English, and I became part of a small community of graduate students. This was at the University of Georgia. Shout out to UGA. There were 30 of us from across campus, all from different departments, and we would gather, I think it was monthly, to talk about teaching and learning and research into teaching and learning and this thing called SoTL. And I was hooked. I knew from then on that I wanted it to be part of my work, part of what's valued in my work. And so I went on as a faculty member, but I've always done SoTL, and so here I am. Now I founded and co-edit with my colleague Gary Poole, who just recently retired from University of British Columbia. Teaching and Learning Inquiry, the picture that Margie showed earlier, it's the journal of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So let me just put a plug for it there. But okay, let me move on. I'm going to talk about getting started in doing SoTL, just those initial steps. I had posted in the chat a link to my SoTL guide online that can take you through kind of in more detail and further through the process, but just to get you started and thinking about how each and every one of you is in a position to do a SoTL project. SoTL typically starts with what Randy Bass described as problems. Now, this is always problematic to start with because, of course, we have these negative connotations of problem in general. But what he does in his piece called The Scholarship of Teaching, What's the Problem? He looks at the word problem from the perspective of our research and how in our research, problem is a good thing. Problem is where we start. Problem is exciting and generative, and it's where our research begins. Whereas in teaching, a problem is something that we're ashamed of, we don't talk about, we want it to go away quickly. We don't want to dwell in it and savor in it and explore it and spend a year or two learning more about it. And he really challenges us to re-see that, and that's what the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is. So starting by thinking about a problem in the Bass sense in student learning that emerges from your practice. You know, what is something that students are challenged by, confused by, etc. And then from there, Pat Hutchings leads us to thinking about questions. So we move from problems to questions that we ask about those problems She has a wonderful little taxonomy that you can see here in this table, a taxonomy of SoTL questions. You can read more about it in her opening chapter, but there are basically 4 different kinds of SoTL questions. The first 2 that you see on your screen are the most common by far. A what works question. You know, I want to try flipping the classroom, and I want to see if students learn more from flipping this lesson, flipping this activity, having them read all about it outside of class so that I don't have to lecture about it in class, and instead they discuss it, they practice it, etc. That's a what works. Does it work? Another kind that we see less frequently, but it's my favorite kind, and we need more of in the field, is a what is question. Descriptive of what does it look like when students learn X, or when they don't learn X, when they're confused by, when they have misconceptions about. So these aren't yet trying to fix anything. They're instead trying to fully understand something about student learning in our context. Much room for us to learn more about our students and their learning and how they learn, how they don't learn, etc. So what is questions are particularly powerful. You can see the other kinds of questions here, but they're less common and not typically where we start. After you kind of explore the problem and then ask some questions about it and kind of figure out what kind of question is it, you need to think about how can I collect evidence of student learning that answers my question, that actually answers that question, and that's critical in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So pause on that question if you do SoTL and really dwell on it, think about it, talk to others about it. What evidence of student learning would answer that question? Here's just a small range of evidences, of data, if you will, samples of student work. You know, you can always start with what are the assignments and activities you already have your learners doing? Is there something in that that you can analyze, read from the perspective of your question? So start there, and then think about, is there additional data or evidence that I can gather to help me more fully answer the question? And you can see some of those samples here. Formative assessments like the minute paper, you know, at the end of your session with a student saying, okay, or with a group of students, you know, take out a sheet of paper, don't write your name on it, tell me what you think the big takeaway from what you learned today was. You can learn a lot from what students say there. Think aloud, different ways of documenting student process, those intermediate stages in learning that Dan Bernstein and Randy Bass talk about a good bit, that there's so much more that we can learn about those intermediate stages. You can see, again, you know, a range of other kinds of data. I want to pause at the last row with just a slight caution. Be careful about relying solely or relying too heavily on evidence in the form of student self-reports of learning. This is a fairly common weak spot, I think, in the scholarship of teaching and learning that we always try to guide people away from. Self-reports of learning, you know, students, here's what, you know, do you think you learned about such and such, or what do you think you learned? Asking them what they learned or what they prefer, or if they're satisfied, if they like something, that gives us some information, yes. That may help answer some questions, yes. It does not show us what students learn. It does not answer that specific question about learning. Again, it can give us some information about the affective components of the learning process, but it's not direct evidence of did they actually learn. So that's just a quick caution. Yeah, and a quick switching to here. I posted in the chat a link to my SoTL guide that kind of walks you through it, but here's a lovely screenshot of that web page. How exciting is that? I am going to pass the screen to, or pass the globe to Margie, right?
Yep.
1, 2, 3, catch. Did that work? Okay, there it goes.
Okay. And we're now just going to give you some examples. So I'm not sure how clear it is on the page, but this is one of my favorite pieces of librarian SoTL out there. And not just because I know the author quite well and she's a friend and colleague, but Becky Wilson was a librarian at our institution. She's since moved on to Glasgow. And she was one of the first librarians to really be formally involved in scholarship of teaching and learning. And she had a question about what actually happens during the work that students do while they're working on their own in a class. And while we were preparing for this, I was chatting with Nancy and Kara and said, I think one of our signature pedagogies, perhaps in library world, is to provide some exposure to a database and then scaffolded practice in using it, for better or worse. Becky was interested in what actually was going on during that practice time. And one of the reasons I chose this article is because it's also an example of SoTL where the data was captured during a one-shot. Because I often hear from librarians, how can I do SoTL? I just teach in one-shots. Well, here's how. So Becky had the students use pads of paper that were carbonless copy paper as they worked through their searches. And she had a chart that's reproduced in the article where she asked them to articulate what they were searching, what a note about what they found, and things that they wanted to do next time to change their search, notes to self. And they did this in the carbonless copy paper. And I have to tell you, the students thought carbonless copy paper was the bee's knees. They were just intrigued that you could write on one piece of paper and it would show up on the other piece of paper like magic. It was a lot of fun. Watching, I actually observed one of these sessions. And so she worked through that and she looked at a close reading of what the students actually wrote, found some growing sophistication as the searches went on during the class, but also some gaps that there were sort of universal misapplications of phrase searching, of quotations, that may have been leading or may have indicated that students weren't understanding part of the presentation or weren't seeing the value, perhaps, of quotations. So this was not really a what works session. This was a what is session. And she did it to some extent to challenge assumptions. It's sort of the well duh moment around instruction that if we give them time to practice, they'll get better. And they might, but not necessarily in ways that we expect and not necessarily as much as we might expect in a 1 hour or 90-minute session. So that's why I chose that example. And it's a good example of how to conduct a study. There's really good, rigorous methodology in it. It's written up well, provides adequate data to support the conclusions. So have at her. And yes, it's open access. I think then I'll pass that on to Kara, who's next.
Yes. So I pulled a couple of examples out just to speak briefly about. A few notes about these examples. I pulled out examples that showed librarians and disciplinary faculty collaborating on research projects that meet the definition of the scholarship of teaching and learning. And you'll see the first one there is strategies for integrating information literacy and academic literacy, helping undergraduate students make the most of scholarly articles. And that is by our own beloved Margie. I like to think of her as the mother of SoTL and librarianship.
No, you are.
But Margie obviously is a librarian, and Allison's a professor in public relations at Mount Royal University. So together, they sought to help students overcome difficulty with engaging with the scholarly literature. And, you know, this is an issue that is of concern to librarians, but also concern to faculty, so it was ideal for a collaboration. And they did a follow-up survey to determine the effectiveness of the workshop that they developed to help students read a scholarly article. So I like this. It's a, you know, it's a sound study, and it really shows that of interest, overlap of research and teaching interest between a librarian and a faculty member. Another example that I've given here is research performance in undergraduates receiving face-to-face versus online library instruction, a citation analysis. And there was a question asked on Twitter as to whether SoTL research was limited to classroom research or also would expand to digital pedagogies. And I would certainly argue, this one looks at online library instruction, but I would argue that there's a whole world waiting to be tapped and researched in terms of SoTL questions and online learning and digital pedagogies. If you're interested in that, I think it's a fantastically open arena for where there's a lot of research needed. So in this particular article, Clark is a librarian and Tinberg is a professor in business and technology, and they used a slightly different methodology. They turned to a citation analysis to compare student papers written by students receiving library instruction online versus face-to-face, which I think is a question that we've all dealt with. So again, another example of overlapping areas of concern and a successful collaboration between a librarian and a faculty member. The other thing of note here that ties back to earlier questions about how do you find the SoTL literature is these articles don't really self-identify as SoTL. They qualify as SoTL. They're SoTL research, but they're not really labeled as such. So it is tricky. I certainly will not deny that it is tricky to find research, SoTL research, because you do need to use such a broad set of search terms. So those are the two articles I wanted you to have a look at, just as examples, and I'll pass it over to Nancy.
Great. My example, and I'll paste the citation in the chat. I'm embarrassed to say that my example I co-authored. Margie made me. So I chose this example because Margie made me, but it's an article that I wrote with a couple of other colleagues in English. First, let me tell you why I picked it, and then I'll tell you a little more about it. So here, this is a SoTL article by We Are Not Librarians. We love librarians, but we are not librarians. We're English professors. But the article and our project, I think, would be of interest outside of our discipline. And so, yeah, so I think that's an important reason to share it. Another, if you actually look at the whole article, and I'm sorry to say that it is not open access, boo. If you look at the article, you'll see that it's written the way English folk write. It does come from our disciplinary expertise, our disciplinary voices, and so we don't have an article here that's in the traditional kind of social science IMRAD structure, the introduction, methodology, et cetera. Instead, it's an essay. I mean, we don't really have a name for this structure other than it's a bunch of paragraphs. Yeah. So it's to show you another way that SoTL can look. Also, kind of going back to who it's relevant for, it is written by 3 English professors, and it is about a specific idea in English, but it transcends English. So let me briefly tell you about it. Oh, and Margie segued into it earlier without realizing it. She was talking about carbonless copy paper. In this article, we used overhead transparencies. Remember those? Love overhead transparencies. She also talked about the bee's knees. Well, here we used Billy Collins' poem and pressing an ear against the hive. So anyway, in this article, we talked about a project in which we looked at how students in literature classes respond to complexity, ambiguity, difficulty in literary texts. Often they respond by shutting down or glossing complexity or ambiguity. At times I've had students honestly tell me that it frustrated them to such an extent that they threw the book across the room. Whereas literary scholars, we love those moments of difficulty. That's our problem in the Randy Bass sense. We respond to those moments of difficulty very differently, and we want students to see those moments of complexity as meaningful. So we designed what's called a lesson study project, something I want to strongly recommend to you because it would be great to have librarians doing lesson study projects just with each other, or with colleagues with students, etc. So let me just put a plug out there for lesson study projects. Bill Serbin quite literally wrote the book on it, C-E-R-B-I-N, so maybe someone can type that into the chat. Anyway, we designed a lesson study project in which we together designed a single lesson, a single class period, one class period. Does that sound familiar? In which students read and responded to a poem that is kind of notoriously complex, has multiple meanings in it. Theodore Rusky's My Papa's Waltz. Is it a poem about abuse, a child that's abused, or is it a poem about a boy who loves his father? Well, it's really both. And that can be off-putting to students because that's kind of holding two seemingly contradictory ideas at once. Anyway, so we had students annotate how they read the poem on overhead transparencies and then share with each other how they read them, so that what they saw in these small group discussions were the different interpretations by their group mates. There's more to the project, but ultimately it's a small lesson, a single class period, focused on the broader issue of reading difficult texts. And from what I've heard, people outside of English enjoy reading the article or get something out of it. So check it out. And from here, I shall pass the globe back to Margie.
So, assuming that you've done a wonderful literature review and you've done a brilliant study, you have to think about a couple of things in writing it up that might be a little bit different than writing in your disciplines. First is a really rich description of context. I review for both information literacy journals and SoTL journals, and I have to say that I see a lot more of this in the SoTL journals. Tell us about what the students bring to the class. Have they had information literacy instruction before? What kind of information literacy? Describe what's going on in the class to build up a picture of context. This is especially important if you are writing for a non-library audience. So if you're submitting this to a SoTL journal or a discipline-specific journal, you can't assume that they understand, your readers will understand what goes on in a library session, in information literacy instruction. So you may need to define a whole bunch of things that you don't normally define in writing in your disciplinary literature. I've been told that I had to define information literacy, and I thought, oh God, no, that just takes so long now. But you know, I managed it for a wider audience because we assume these discussions have common language, and when we're writing outside our discipline, that's the understanding needs of diverse audiences part. You really need to think about that. It also helps to overwrite this, like write as much detail as you can down as soon as the session or what your context for studying has ended. I tip, do that thick description as much as you can in the moment or as close to the moment as you can. And then build it up with more detail the more you know about where the students are coming from, what eventually happened to their work, what work they did after your intervention that you might be describing, and so on, right? So write it in the moment so you remember what it was like, and then build on it and add it for your researchers, and assume that your researchers know nothing of what goes on in information literacy instruction, because many of them will not. And then this also is where, going back to the SoTL literature, can really help you. It can give you models for writing things up, models for what is helpful to readers in understanding descriptions, and models for, frankly, what gets past peer reviewers at a very, very practical level. So that's all I think I have to say about writing it up. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to change the slide up now and then pass the ball to Kara, who's going to talk more about where to write it up.
Thanks, Margie. So, yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about dissemination. And really, in my mind, SoTL opens the doors to a whole wide range of conference and publication opportunities and venues. With respect to conferences, of course, we all know the library conferences that focus on information literacy, so things like LOEX, WILU here in Canada, LILC in the States, ESO in Europe. They're interested in research on teaching, including SoTL work. There's also SoTL-specific conferences. So the biggie is the annual conference of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. It's going to be in Calgary later this year. Yeah, Margie's heavily involved in that, as you might imagine, being in Calgary. Well, yes, Nancy too, for sure. And then there's also many regional options around North America. So I've seen postings for conferences. I know there's one in, I think there's one in Georgia that does SoTL research, and you'll find them in different regions. Also look at university teaching and learning conferences that, while they may not have SoTL in their names, usually welcome SoTL, and increasingly I see that they have a stream dedicated to SoTL research. And finally, don't forget about discipline-specific conferences. So SoTL on information literacy in a field, whether that's biology or social work, may be well received at conferences that are dedicated to the discussion of teaching in those disciplines. And publication options for SoTL research are similarly broad. So of course we have the library journals that have an interest in instruction and probably have already published SoTL research, some under that name, some not, but certainly meeting the criteria for SoTL research. There's also several journals dedicated to publishing SoTL research, and others that might be more general teaching journals without SoTL in the title again, but still publish this type of work. And then look to the disciplines. So most academic disciplines have journals dedicated to teaching, and these are an excellent venue for your work. So social work education comes to mind. I published an information literacy article. It wasn't a SoTL article, but an IL article in the European Journal of Engineering Education. And several faculty members at my institution actually found it and commented on it. And I'm pretty sure these guys don't sit around reading library journals. So it was really an effective way to bring the issues of concern and my research, myself as a researcher, to their attention by publishing in a journal in their discipline. So there's lots of potential to broaden your audience and to engage with faculty in your institution, whether they're maybe reading what you write or maybe collaborating with you in writing it. We've included links to many of these dissemination venues, so the conferences and journals I've mentioned, in the materials that we've shared on Google Docs. So you may want to take a look there if you're looking for some ideas around dissemination. And undoubtedly, you find yourself wanting more SoTL. We fit what we could into this series of 2 presentations, but I did just want to bring your attention to a few things. First of all, the first part of this webinar, Foundational Discussion of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. The recording is available, so take a look at that if you weren't able to attend. The hashtag, keep the discussion going, librarian SoTL. You'll find there's lots of discussion there, particularly when there's events, conferences, so on, going on. But periodically in between those events as well, you will find that there's some good discussion going on. Look at that Google Doc. The bit.ly link is on the site, so you'll find things there, including our ACRL 2017 panel presentation slides, tips for getting started in SoTL. I particularly like the list of cool SoTL projects, as well as a resource list, and the call for proposals, which brings me to the forthcoming title from ACRL that several of the both presenters and participants in today's session are involved in various capacities, called the Grounded Instruction Librarian Participating in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And the call for proposals for case studies for that book is now open. It actually closes tomorrow, but I hear whispers that perhaps something that comes in slightly after the deadline might still be considered. So do give some do give some thought to that as well, and watch for that book when it appears. So yeah, Rhonda, please submit. We're still looking for a few additional submissions to round out the book, but it's going to be a really good product, I think. So so that's what I had to say. I think we were going to open it up for questions now, and I see one there that I think relates to Margie's point about providing the context for your research. So maybe I will turn it over to her to answer that. I don't hear Margie. I will jump in here just while we're waiting for Margie. I think the thing is, your reader is going to want to know how applicable is this research to their context. And knowing more about your context is going to help them in that assessment. So to me, that's when I'm writing something like this, that's why I'm doing it. So if I have a class of all English as additional language learners, it's going to help me to assess the applicability of a SoTL project that I'm reading if I know that the learners in that environment were similar to mine. So I think that, to my mind, that's why this comes in. Margie, you may want to add something.
Yeah, I'm back now. So the question on numbers, in SoTL it can vary all the way from multi-site, multi-year, multi-class studies to very focused in-depth studies of a smaller group of individuals, like Carol Coulthall's work, where she followed, I think, 6 people, but very, very closely. So there's no real average. I would say that the majority of the SoTL work that I've read is based on a single class. So class sizes also vary, maybe a range between 20 and 100 would be as close as I can get to an average number of participants in a SoTL study.
Another question that came up that's sort of starting to discuss a little bit with participants, but this happened over on Twitter. Someone asked about harkening back to the IRB discussion, and if you need to make sure you have your question answering methods determined before going before the review board. Do you guys mind talking a little bit about that?
I can tell you as a member of the review board, they do want to know the details. So they want to know who you're planning to ask what. You know, very specifically, if you're planning to ask questions, survey questions, interview questions, anything like that, they are actually going to want to see the survey tools that you're using. So you do need to be fairly far along in your thinking about your research before you go through that ethics board approval process. They want to know what they're approving.
Yeah, I can say, though, that it's a really good way of concentrating the mind. I find that filling out our institution's forms, while long, really helps me focus on what exactly am I trying to do, and has in the past exposed some flaws that I need to address before I show anybody else what I'm intending to do. So it's articulating it for an IRB or an REB is a really good way of strengthening what it is that you're trying to do and linking it to the kind of evidence that you're trying to collect.
Great, and sort of on that same path there, in terms of particular projects that could be good for collaboration, Kate asked about curriculum or course redesign as a potential for a SoTL project.
For sure. Nancy, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah. There's actually more interest these days in that kind of broad 90s, although the work is older, is done on a single class or a single course or a few classes that one teaches. But people in recent years have been saying, you know, learning happens in other classes. Students learn across a range of classes or across a curriculum. So there's more and more work done on the curriculum scale, looking at an entire or something like that. And in terms of course redesign, now that's such an interesting idea because, you know, I mean, that's squarely in the neighborhood for SoTL because, you know, what and how did students learn when I taught the course this way? And then what and how do students learn when I teach the course this other way? So yes, absolutely, great.
And a good place to get ahead of a research project too, if you think there's a course redesign in your future now, so that you can use some of the data from your current version.
Great, thank you very much. Oh, Rhonda has extended an invitation to Kate to write for the book. Yeah, you totally should submit something, Kate. Another question that has come in on the chat, some stipends for professional development related to information literacy and learning outcomes. I'm guessing the library for faculty, but do you all have other suggestions for collaborating or pulling faculty in on projects if you don't have any funds to share with them? You've touched on this a little bit, but if maybe you have some other ideas for reluctant faculty, perhaps?
One idea, or one thing I would say is maybe don't start with a reluctant faculty. Try to start with those who have demonstrated some interest teaching, improving their teaching, learning more about their teaching. So maybe that is being aware of who has published something in SoTL or has published something on a teaching-related topic or issue. Another strategy, I think, is to scope out some of the events at your university teaching center. Start talking to people, because the people who are attending those events are people who are thinking about their teaching, wanting to improve their teaching, often wanting to investigate their teaching, you know, and get a project or two under your belt, and then word starts to spread. Oh, this librarian is interested in this particular topic, or has done some research on this, and take it from there. So that would be my advice in that
Nancy,
regard.
can I just jump in here?
Yes, please.
Gabe asks a great question on Twitter.
Oh, good. I'm glad you saw that. I was going to bring that in.
We've been talking about one-shot workshops, but what about for the reference or research consultation interactions? Yes, 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 yes. Wow, I think that is such a rich area of teaching, frankly, that could be so explored in SoTL work. I mean, I won't speak to it because I'm not a librarian, but in my mind, I wonder if that is a signature pedagogy of librarians, that interaction, that one-on-one consultation. Not that there's only one signature pedagogy, but oh yes, imagine the rich information you could get from just working with a student on that kind of one-on-one basis and exploring misconceptions, points of confusions, how they understand.
Yeah, that's great. And Lauren just mentioned in Lauren Hayes mentioned in the chat about micro, meso, macro, and mega levels of SoTL, and she talked about that. We hosted a SoTL discussion forum via SLIC at Midwinter Google Docs. So if you want to hear Lauren talking about, I remember at Midwinter, or maybe it was even at ACRL now, I can't remember, but that kind of blew my mind to be thinking of those levels. So
if I can say the paper that Allison and I did started to some extent with my having a lot of questions from students on how to cite from the literature review, because that was as far as they were reading through questions that we get in those one-to-one interactions. Don't ignore those as sparks for larger research projects. They're a pretty rich source.
Yes, absolutely. So we're getting pretty close here to the end of our time, and I think that we have covered all the questions that came up in the chat. Does anyone have, oh, and there's been a couple of things I just want to point out that a few people have mentioned using the ACRL framework as a sort of a spark or a way to explore different class dynamics. I think that's definitely some, and maybe we can even, who knows, do another webinar down the line that talks a little bit more about those connections. But does anyone have any last thoughts or questions?
Tara, I think we should probably let these good people go and get their proposals finished up for tomorrow, for tomorrow's deadline.
Yes, I love that. I'm going to share the link again, so that way. All right, so there's that link again, and the bit.ly link for the resources that we've been sharing is here again, and we should have the recording for today's session available in a couple of days. On behalf of the SLIC group and the instruction section of ACRL, I just want to say thank you again to our presenters. Darby, you're totally right. They're some of the best presenters, and they're fun to listen to. So I'm very happy that you all took time to talk with us for 2 different dates. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Melissa.
You're welcome.
Thank you.